93, y'all. Yo, 131, the Grumpy Thelemite with Thelemic Union. Today we're talking about Samadhi explaining Thelema. Alright, so the title of this video is Samadhi explains Thelema. Thelema, of course, is the religious magical philosophy of Aleister Crowley. If you don't know what that is, this video is probably a little too complicated for you. I recommend going back or maybe watching some introductory videos on what is Thelema and so on first. For those who are a bit more advanced, this video is intended to explain how Samadhi is actually a central concept in Aleister Crowley's thinking and is a way to understand how Thelema works philosophically in multiple ways. So it's metaphysics, it's soteriology, it's eschatology, it's ethics. All of them are tied up with this idea of Samadhi. So we'll talk about what is Samadhi, at least how did Crowley understand it? How does it appear in Thelema? How does it explain Thelema? And some examples of how Crowley himself saw Samadhi, or whatever he chose to call it in that moment. The thing referred to as Samadhi is a central concept in his thinking. So first of all, I wanted to start off with some quotations. You know how I love quoting Crowley. Why are we doing this? Well, Aleister Crowley is the creator of Thelema, essentially. He's known as the prophet. He received the book of the law. Of course, some of these ideas in Thelema were existent before Thelema, but they were never combined in their particular way. So Crowley took a lot of disparate ideas. He had his own spiritual experiences, and he created Thelema. So Crowley is in a privileged position, so to speak. Not that he has white privilege, of course he did, but in this sense we mean that he is in a position to better understand Thelema than the average person. If you believe the book of the law has some kind of divine origin, is a divine revelation, well, it specifically calls Crowley out as the beast, 666. It asks him to write a comment on it by his wisdom. It does not call out any other person in a similar way. It's pretty obvious that Crowley's opinion is central to understanding the system of Thelema. If you want to say, oh, well, I want to understand Thelema however I want, that's great. That's probably not Thelema, though. That's your own thing with a Thelemic flavor, and that's fine. But my intent is not to promote my own personal philosophy here. It's to try to explain Aleister Crowley's understanding of his own philosophy, his own religion of Thelema. So, with that caveat out of the way, you start looking at some quotations. So the first one comes from Book 4, Part 1. You probably know that Book 4, also known as Liber ABA, Liber ABA, Book 4, Magick, has lots of different names. It's considered Crowley's magnum opus, his most complete, most comprehensive work. Just to give you an idea, his book Magick in Theory and Practice is obviously very famous, extremely influential. So it's just part 3 of this book. So a lot of people don't understand that part 1 of Liber ABA, part 1 of Magick, is mysticism. Right? So the entire first part is about how Crowley understood Eastern mysticism, specifically Raja Yoga, and how he thinks this is a necessary aspect, in some sense a preliminary to magical work, and in another sense a complement to magical work. Right? But he saw meditation, yoga, contemplation, and mysticism as so important that he put it as the first part in his book. So in one part he says this: as will be seen later, the vision of God or union with God or Samadhi or whatever we may agree to call it has many kinds and many degrees. So just stopping there for a second, Crowley understood Samadhi as the union with God. There is no question about this. If you want to say, oh, well, Samadhi isn't union with God or this or that, it doesn't matter. That is how unequivocally Aleister Crowley understood it. So what he's doing here is he's drawing a connection between Eastern mysticism in their concept of what you might call superconsciousness, cosmic consciousness, Samadhi, a non-dual consciousness, and drawing a parallel with Western mysticism, where at least in Christian and Islamic mysticism, in Judeo-Christian and Islamic mysticism, union with God is inevitably always going to be the main purpose, the main goal of that system. So Crowley was a perennialist. He thought there was a single truth underlying all philosophies, underlying all religions. Yoga was one of them. Christianity, Islam, different forms of Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, all sorts of practices and systems all conceal the same inner truth. So to him, Samadhi and union with God are literally two terms for the exact same thing. And what is that thing? Crowley understood Samadhi to be the union of subject and object in consciousness, which annihilates both of them and creates a unitary or monistic consciousness. Sometimes he doesn't even call it consciousness, because consciousness implies duality. It implies the duality of subject and object. So sometimes it's called superconsciousness, or even the destruction of consciousness because of its transcending of duality. So Crowley, in this quote, is identifying Samadhi with union with God. And he says, to sum up, this is kind of summing up his preliminary remarks in part 1 of book 4. To sum up, we assert a secret source of energy which explains the phenomena of genius. We do not believe in any supernatural explanations, but insist this source may be reached by the following out of definite rules. The degree of success depends upon the capacity of the seeker and not upon the favor of any divine being. So he's saying anyone can achieve union with God. Anyone can achieve Samadhi. It has nothing to do with being a good person or God giving you some favors or grace in order to have this. It is a result of your own hard work, and it is repeatable. In this sense, this is what Crowley really meant by scientific illuminism, that there are certain steps people can take that are reproducible and can give similar results. So he continues and says, we assert that the critical phenomenon which determines success is the occurrence in the brain characterized essentially by the uniting of subject and object. So that is his definition of Samadhi. He's giving a very kind of materialistic account of this as being in the brain, but ultimately it is within the phenomenological experience of your consciousness that this occurs, of course. There are some physical correlates of Samadhi. It's even being studied in neurological neuropsych studies. There, for example, if you're interested in that, Andrew Newberg has studied Carmelite nuns and Buddhist monks meditating, getting into a non-dual state of consciousness and trying to find the neural correlates of that state. Anyways, going to book 2 of book 4, part 2, which is magic, ceremonial magic, he makes this point, which is essentially what I was saying earlier. Note that etymologically, the word sin together with is the Sanskrit sam. In Hebrew, Adonai is Sanskrit Ade. So this is one of Crowley's fake etymologies, or you might say occult etymologies. Kenneth Grant is a huge fan of this, where he just makes things up because they kind of look similar, they kind of sound similar. No anthropologist, no etymologist would agree with 99% of these things, but it shows how Crowley thinks. He's saying the word Samadhi literally means together with God. Sam, together, Adi, God. So he says the phrase together with the Lord is literally identical with the word Samadhi. The Sanskrit name of the phenomenon described by St. Paul, so he's identifying it with Western mysticism, Christian mysticism. This union of ego and non-ego, subject and object, this chemical marriage, thus identical with the symbolism of the rosy cross under a slightly different aspect. So all this union of male and female, the union of rose and cross, the union of cross and circle, all of these symbols are symbols of Samadhi, at least in one aspect of them. Samadhi is fundamentally a symbol, or Samadhi is the process of the two becoming one. The subject and object become a single unitary consciousness. This next quote is from Confessions. I apologize for the quality of this. It's on Hermetic Library, where every half inch there's a different ad of some kind. So I apologize, but there's really no other place to get this for free right now. So this is from Crowley's Confessions, and he says, Samadhi, union with the Lord, is the general term for the final trance or series of trances. Right? So again, he's saying Samadhi, comma, union with the Lord, as if they are the same thing, because he sees them as identical. Just quickly, Samadhi is considered the final stage of samyama, or concentration, the first being dharana, second being dhyana, third being samadhi. So they're all kind of degrees of each other in a way, and samadhi is the term often used for the result, or for simply the final version of this concentration. Of course, there are multiple types of samadhi, different degrees, but ultimately there is a gulf, or an abyss, you might say, between dualistic consciousness and all the things you can experience within that, and samadhi, or super consciousness. Jumping back to Book o' Lies. So Book o' Lies was written in 1913. He wrote, dreams are imperfections of sleep. Even so is consciousness the imperfection of waking. So this is Crowley talking about how dreams are unreal compared to waking consciousness. And yet he's saying this is a parallel to how waking consciousness is itself unreal compared to something else, which is samadhi, superconsciousness. If our interpretation is correct, there would be some evidence of this in his commentary to this chapter. So now we have the commentary for that line. It says this chapter is to be read in connection with chapter 8, also with those previous chapters in which reason is attacked. The allusion in the title is obvious. This sum in proportion. Dream is to waking as waking is to samadhi. Is a favorite analogy with Frater Perdurabo, who frequently employs it in his holy discourse. Not his normal discourse, but his holy discourse, right? But this analogy of dream is to waking as waking is to samadhi is exactly what I was just talking about. It also shows his general understanding of samadhi, that it is truly waking up. It is enlightenment, awakening. It's also interesting that in Crowley's system of attainment, there is, of course, the Adeptus minor grade with knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel. And there are many parallels between the union with God, or the knowledge and conversation of Holy Guardian Angel, and samadhi. Right? So Liber LXV, which is entirely about the union of the adept with his angel. The angel is constantly called God, Adonai, the Lord, because it is an image or some kind of lower tier on the tree of life of God. The union with the Holy Guardian Angel is understood under the figure of Abrahadabra, which is the union of the 5 and the 6, the union of microcosm and macrocosm, of subject and object, ego and non-ego. They're all the same thing. Some are more fancy symbols, fancy words, some are less so, but they're all about the union of opposites to create a kind of third thing, which in our consciousness is samadhi, monistic consciousness, non-dual consciousness, whatever you want to call it. So the pinnacle, in a way, at least the second major stopping point in Crowley's system of attainment is when you cross the abyss and you become a master, or a Magister Templi, master of the temple. This requires the complete annihilation of one's ego or self-identity. In One Star in Sight, where he describes this system of AA, he describes Magister Templi, and at the end he says he is a master of samadhi. And so the two main attainments in Crowley's system are not really magical in any real sense. They are mystical in their essence. The knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel is the union with God, the perfection of this, becoming a master of non-duality, not attaching to one's ego identity, to one's mind and body, one's normal personality. That is a qualification, a prerequisite for being a Magister Templi, who is a master of samadhi. Remember this famous line in Magic and Theory and Practice, that there is a single main definition of the object of all magical ritual. It is the uniting of microcosm with macrocosm. The supreme and complete ritual is therefore the invocation of the Holy Guardian Angel, or in the language of mysticism, union with God. So you don't have to believe me that the HGA is essentially union with God. Crowley says this, and this is just one of like 61 different times that he says this in different ways. So Crowley says, Samadhi is union of opposites. It's the uniting of microcosm and macrocosm, of subject and object, the union of the self with God, which is identical to the invocation of the Holy Guardian Angel. He says all other magical rituals are particular cases of this general principle. He goes on to say famously that if you're trying to attain anything other than union with God, anything other than union with your angel, that's black magic. So really, everything that we consider to be magic in the sense of occultism, of rituals and so on, of sigils, those are all black magic as long as they are not devoted to this one end of what is essentially a mystical goal of union with God. Of course, in Thelema, we don't always say the word God. We have many other terms for this. We can identify with Hadith. We can dissolve into Nuit. There's a million different ways to say the same idea, but there are so many different, such a multiplicity of symbols and signs and names that it's easy to miss the forest for the trees. So how does Samadhi explain Thelema? How is it an organizing principle of understanding the philosophy of Thelema? Well, I've already said this, but Samadhi and Crowley's emphasis on Samadhi aligns Thelema with all other mystical traditions of the world. Crowley was a perennialist. He thought there was a single underlying truth. All other philosophies are essentially degraded forms of that truth, because the nature of communication is that we cannot perfectly communicate truth. And so every religion, every philosophy is in a sense another imperfect way of describing that ultimate nameless truth. So with Samadhi being the goal of mystical and magical practices in Thelema in reality, it aligns Thelema with esoteric forms of all traditions, with Eastern mysticism, Western mysticism. It aligns itself much more cleanly with the ideology of other perennial philosophies of a single underlying unity, which is often nameless. Sometimes you call it God, and so on. First of all, I think it's important to understand that Crowley thought Samadhi gave some kind of insight into the nature of reality and the truth of Thelema. In chapter 11 of Book of Lies, he says, concerning the holy three in naught. Right? So this is Crowley's kind of one-up on the Christian mystic 3 in 1, 1 in 3, 3 in 1. But our one, our unity, is understood as nothing, as naught, for various reasons I won't go into at this moment. But he says, concerning the holy three in naught, Nuit, Hadith, Rahur, Kuit, who are those three in naught, are only to be understood by the master of the temple. They're above the abyss and contain all contradiction in themselves. So they're only to be understood by a master of the temple because he has attained to Samadhi, is a master of Samadhi even, has crossed the abyss and no longer identifies with his temporal sense of self, his body, his mind, his history, and so on. So becoming a master of the temple is actually required to fully understand the metaphysics, the cosmology of Thelema in the first place. I mean, all these explanations of Nuit is the night sky and infinite possibilities, Hadith is the perceiver, these are not 100% accurate. They're not entirely true. There are, in a sense, an initiated perspective. And someone who is enlightened or has attained has a supra-rational understanding of these things beyond the normal discursive mind through their own experience of non-duality and the truth of reality. They can better understand what is truly meant by Nuit, Hadith, Rahur, Kuit. So in terms of metaphysics, it establishes that we can only truly understand the metaphysics of Thelema through Samadhi, through a mystical, experiential understanding, not through me explaining on YouTube, not through you reading books, but through you doing the work and attaining this reality, this ultimate reality for yourself. In this way, it's also the soteriology. It's how you transcend, how you become enlightened, how you become liberated, or a savior. The entire purpose of Samadhi is to essentially reclaim your stellar heritage, the starry perspective, the Keter point of view, for those of you who like the Kabbalah. The star is the true self in the sense that it is beyond incarnation, it is beyond space and time, it is beyond any one particular identity, it is an a monistic consciousness. So Samadhi approximates, at least, this identity, where it brings your awareness into a non-dual space, so to speak. That non-duality is beyond categories. It is beyond space, beyond time, beyond causality. And it cannot know anything because knowledge requires a knower and a thing known. So it's beyond knowledge. That's why we say it is above the abyss, where Da'at represents knowledge, the crown of the Ruach or the mind, which cannot penetrate beyond the abyss. That requires the destruction of duality through Samadhi. It also aligns us with the ontology of Thelema, which is 0 equals 2. The entire creation story of Thelema is that 0, which we call Nuit, but Nuit is an imperfect name for it. In the same way that the Tao named is not truly the Tao, Nuit named is not truly Nuit. He even says in Liber L that let us not speak of thee as one, but as none, and let us not speak of thee at all, since thou art continuous. So the creation story of Thelema is 0 becoming 2. The undifferentiated unity divides and becomes a multiplicity, which is our world, our consciousness, our awareness of the world with ourselves, our bodies, the chairs, the tables, the air, the water, and so on. The reason for this is the 0 is dividing itself for love's sake, for the possibility of experience, for the possibility of Hadith uniting with Nuit in new possibilities, new experiences. So the 0 becomes 2 to know itself. Now we are 2. That's where we start. We are myself, and I myself, and opposed to something that is not myself. Ego versus non-ego, subject versus object. Normally we have one subject, my sense of self, many objects. The point of meditation is to narrow that object down to one object in dharana. Then there's one subject, one object that becomes fixed in concentration. As this concentration grows, as you grow in intensity, inflame thyself in prayer, those two eventually unite in dhyana. That union becomes perfect in samadhi. So the 2 become 0 again. In a sense, we go back to before creation. Solva et coagula. Right? So we dissolve, we reformulate. After samadhi, we come back to earth. We don't explode forever. We don't dissolve into nothingness forever. Eventually the ego reforms. We come back to earth. A star is cast down from the abyss, or whatever other metaphor you want to use. But after the samadhi, after dipping into the refreshing pool of naught, you come back into 2 as a kind of more perfect image of your true self. Right, so this is a quotation from chapter 20 of Magic and Theory and Practice. Crowley says here, just as initiation insists on the annihilation of the individual in the impersonal infinity of existence to emerge once more as a less confused and deformed eidolon or image of the truth of himself. Right, so initiation insists on the annihilation of the individual in the impersonal infinity of existence. That's a cute way of saying God, or maybe God is a cute way of saying impersonal infinity of existence. And then you emerge once more. 0 becomes 2 again. You solve from 2 to 0. You coagula from 0 back to 2. You become a slightly less confused and deformed image of the truth of yourself. That truth is your identity with God, so to speak. Your identity with Hadith. Even the ethics of Thelema can be explained through samadhi. At least Crowley did this once, where he says, in Confessions, there are many ethical injunctions of a revolutionary character in the book, which is the book of the law, but they are all particular cases of the general precept to realize one's own absolute Godhead, i.e. samadhi, and to act with the nobility which springs from that knowledge. Practically all vices spring from failure to do this. For example, falsehood is invariably the child of fear in one form or another. That's the famous quote from Crowley. Famous enough it was quoted on Home Improvement. Of course, that explains that you cannot make the correct ethical decisions unless you do so from this Godhead, from this consciousness of Samadhi. Just to close out, I wanted to give a few examples from Crowley's commentaries on the Book of the Law, which shows that Samadhi is actually the way he interpreted several lines of Liber L. You would never know this reading it yourself, I don't think, unless you had his commentaries, of course. So it's great that we have these. So line 26, it says, "Then saith the prophet and slave of the beauteous one, Who am I, and what shall be the sign? So she answered him, bending down, a lambent flame of blue, all touching, all penetrant, her love's upon the black earth, lithe body arched for love, soft feet not hurting the flowers. She says, Thou knowest, and the sign shall be my ecstasy, the consciousness of the continuity of existence, the omnipresence of my body." That was her answer. What's the sign? Well, Crowley interpreted this as, he says, the prophet demanding a sign of his mission, it's promised, a Samadhi upon the infinite, which was later fulfilled. He later did have this Samadhi. So this is quite literally how he interprets this line of the Book of the Law, that Nui is saying, the sign of my presence, of my love for you, will be that you attain Samadhi in particular. We also, of course, have the famous line, "I'm divided for love's sake, for the chance of union." These lines, of course, are very important to understanding the cosmogony of Thelema. In his commentary, he says, "It will be said nobody can realize himself so long as the presentation is imperfect, so long as he's incarnated. This is no doubt true in all rigor, but one can obtain an approximation to the intended self-knowledge by withdrawing for a time to the monistic form of self-consciousness, which does not distinguish between ego and non-ego, in other words, by attaining Samadhi." So he's saying that, yeah, it might be true that your ultimate true self, essentially Hadith, whose nature is not, you cannot come to a completely perfect identity with that while you're still incarnated. That might be true, but there is an approximation to that self-knowledge, which is essentially Samadhi. So he's saying, how do you come to this awareness of yourself as Hadith, which is basically the message of the Book of the Law? Samadhi. You, of course, have the next line, "The creation of the world. This is the creation of the world, that the pain of division is as nothing, and the joy of dissolution all." Well, how did Crowley understand this? Well, as to the joy of dissolution, the reference is to Samadhi, the trance in which subject and object become one. So he interpreted this line, the joy of dissolution that's available as kind of reparation for the creation of the world is Samadhi, the two becoming one, or none, as we call it in Thelema. There's also this line, 51, where it describes the palace. It says there's 4 gates to one palace. The floor of that palace is of silver and gold. Lapis lazuli and jasper are there. And all rare scents, jasmine and rose, the emblems of death, etc., etc. Now, if we scroll down to the commentary, it says the rare scents are possibly various ecstasies of samadhis. So even the scents in this kind of astral mystical temple are representing Samadhi. Line 53, "Ecstasy be thine," it should say, "and joy of earth ever to me, to me." How did he understand this promise? I am promised ecstasy, i.e. Samadhi, and joy of earth. Again, references to ecstasy, to all, to dissolution, seem to, in Crowley's mind, refer specifically to Samadhi. Line 58, "Nor do I demand aught in sacrifice," etc., etc. Crowley interprets this as the ritual of worship of Nuit is Samadhi. Think about this. The way to truly worship Nuit is to dissolve into her, is to unite oneself in love under will in the ultimate form, which is the union of self and not self, subject and object, i.e. Samadhi. So that's pretty much that. Obviously, this is not a comprehensive, in-depth discussion of every single instance. Crowley's talked about Samadhi. Obviously, it's not meant to be a comprehensive, mystical, intellectual treatise on Samadhi or Thelema, but I think this would be helpful for a lot of people who don't understand the essential centrality of mysticism, of the union with God / Samadhi, to the system of Thelema and to Crowley's thinking. Of course, there's many other ways I could make the argument, many other quotes. But I think it's sufficient to make the point. To make the point at least. So, if you've made it this far into the video, you're probably pretty interested in Thelema. So thank you for watching. If you're interested in more, check out our other videos. Hit like, hit subscribe, of course. You can also check out our website at ThelemicUnion.com. There's lots of cool articles from all sorts of contemporary Thelemites on different philosophical, social issues connected with Thelema. We also have an online course that is 120 days Introduction to Aleister Crowley's System of Magical Practice. It is an online course basically structured to progressively introduce you to the Thelemic practices that hopefully lead you to the attainment of your true will. So check that out at ThelemicUnion.com. Please become a patron. If you like this content, please consider becoming a patron on patreon.com. Otherwise, feel free to leave a comment below what you liked, what you didn't like, if you have any questions, any suggestions for future videos. All right, 93.